Hello there, this is my first non-school related video, so we'll see how it goes. The purpose of this video is to address the implications of the recent Chinese antitrust slash cybersecurity slash big tech crackdowns on the future of the Chinese economy. I'm making this video because I just feel like there are a lot of really bad takes on this issue that all boil down to your personal opinion of China, which doesn't really affect anything. So I decided to do some research myself, and in this video, I will explain the process that I went through to formulate my thesis. Because a lot of the bad takes that I mentioned are news articles, I will try to stick to avoiding them and sharing the primary sources instead, but most of these are in Chinese, so there might be a few translation errors. It is what it is. The video will be split into 5 sections. They should be time-stamped. Section 1 is just a brief timeline of what's been going on these past few months in China, so that should help you get caught up if you aren't already. Just a heads up before we start, this video will be entirely qualitative. I won't be looking at the financials of any company, just because if that's something you actually want to watch, I'm sure there are better videos out there, or just do it yourself. Yeah, a lot of Chinese stocks look very cheap, but you have to discount their fair values due to the political risk of owning Chinese stocks, and that's what I'll be discussing in this video. So, in October 2020, Ant Group was preparing for its $34 billion initial public offering, a dual debut on the Shanghai and Hong Kong stock exchanges. On the 24th, Jack Ma, who has a large stake in Ant Group, delivered his now infamous Old Man's Club speech, where he criticized Chinese regulation for stifling growth. Then, on November 3rd, Ant announces the suspension of their IPO on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, citing vague regulatory reasons. This prompted them to also halt the Hong Kong listing and indefinitely postpone their IPO. December 11th, the Politburo of the CCP met to discuss economic matters. In the official press release, it is mentioned that they will strengthen antitrust efforts. More on this meeting in Section 2. On December 24th, the State Administration for Market Regulation, or SAMR, released a brief statement that Alibaba is being investigated for monopolistic behaviors, including the choose one from two policy. Its shares on the New York Stock Exchange fell 13% that day. For a few months, all is quiet from Beijing. April 10th, 2021. The investigation is complete, and SAMR fines Alibaba $2.8 billion. It is found that 二选一, or choose one from two, is a policy implemented by Alibaba to force their merchants using multiple e-commerce platforms to only sell their products on Alibaba, otherwise have their products suppressed by the Alibaba search engine. Alibaba even sent screenshots of merchants' products on other websites to them, implying that they need to remove them. I personally agree with this specific piece of antitrust regulation banning this sort of behavior, but this is just the beginning. Throughout April and May, there is continued regulatory pressure and increased investigations on a variety of sectors. Among those is the ride-sharing industry, which is dominated by Didi. Despite ongoing antitrust regulations and having to pay small fines in May, Didi proceeds with their June 30th IPO on the New York Stock Exchange and raises $4.4 billion. July 2nd, the Cyberspace Administration of China, or the CAC, announces a cybersecurity investigation on Didi. Although not directly stated, it is clear that Beijing disapproves of Didi's overseas listing, especially because they hold sensitive information that they collect from China. July 4th, the CAC announces the suspension of the Didi app from Chinese app stores, citing the Cybersecurity Act. Other apps such as Kanzhen and Full Truck Alliance are also suspended. The rest of July is a frenzy. Chinese companies listing overseas using variable interest entities must acquire approval from the party before doing so. The data security law is passed, for-profit tutoring is banned, causing education stocks to drop 80% overnight. Tencent Music is banned from entering into exclusive agreements with artists, and a state-owned newspaper called the gaming industry, quote, spiritual opium in a now-deleted article. This may seem like the CCP has gone ballistic, but many of these actions are actually well received in China. For example, I spoke to someone who said that there are day school teachers in China who teach poorly on purpose and then offer expensive private after-school tutoring. As long as some kids are taking these classes, Other parents wanting their children to stay competitive will also sign up, leading to these exuberant tutoring prices. An all-out ban is extreme and impossible to enforce, but there are not many better options. Finally, July 26th, a 6-month crackdown on big tech is announced by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. Over the past 2 weeks, no new radical announcements have been made, giving companies, regulators, investors, and news outlets time to catch up on the flurry of activities in July and spread more fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Most articles are able to correctly identify what's going on, but where they go wrong is they jump from that straight to a conclusion. And here's where we get these really contradictory sentiments in the market. We have some people thinking, oh, China's deliberately sabotaging their big tech companies. Others are saying, oh, it's just antitrust regulation. We have that in North America too. And then yet others are saying, oh, this is all a power struggle. They just want more power and more control. I mean, this really confuses me because instead of making all these wild assumptions about what the CCP's intentions are, why not listen to what they have to say and figure out their intentions from that? Going into this section, it's important to note that while China runs a mixed economy and many parts of life are privatized, they are still run by a communist party. Now, obviously, there are different branches of communism. You have Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Trotskyism, Maoism. I could go on, right? And if you ask me the difference between those, I couldn't really tell you. But I do know that each of these are ideologies based on certain principles that the founder of that ideology believed in. And this will make more sense later, hopefully. Anyways, I started my research around 2 weeks ago. I don't really have a process for research. I just kind of look through some primary sources until I find something interesting that I can go further down a rabbit hole with. Eventually, I came across a Xinhua news article about the December 11th Politburo meeting in 2020. Xinhua is the state-run press agency of China. If the article didn't say it was from 8 months ago, I would have assumed it was last week or something. It's crazy. Take a look at these talking points. This is the December 11th press conference. If we come down here, we see that they say the meeting also called for strengthened antitrust efforts and the prevention of disorderly expansion of capital. DDIPO? Choose one from two policy? So this is the English version of the press release. I then found the Chinese one. It's more detailed. And the page is translated right now. And take a look at this. Where is it? Here. The meeting stressed that we should strengthen the overall leadership of the party over economic work. We should strengthen political awareness, yada yada, and become an expert in building a new development pattern. So, I don't know about you, but this kind of blows my mind because this is exactly what they're doing right now. So for anyone who read this press release in December and saw that they're planning on massively changing the way they intervene in the economy, the current crackdown shouldn't be unexpected at all. The last point that I'll mention is, if I can find it, right here. The meeting pointed out that next year is a year of special importance. To do a good job in economic work next year, we must take Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as a guide. So, logically, I looked up what that was. And it's quite straightforward. It's just 14 principles that Xi announced in 2012, formalized in 2017. I know this is Wikipedia, but they basically copied from this article, and so... but the formatting on Wikipedia is just easier to read, so that's why I'm using Wikipedia. So what has Xi Jinping thought? Well, if we took a look at a few of the points, number one is ensuring Chinese Communist Party leadership over all forms of work in China. If we then take a look at number 7, practice socialist core values, including Marxism and communism. This is something that they proposed and is now in the Chinese Constitution. It was put in the Chinese Constitution in 2017. It's crazy stuff. And this was a bit surprising to me because the narrative that I've been hearing is that China is continuously liberalizing and opening themselves to the world. So what's going on with this? And also, what is this socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era referring to? Well, to explain this, we need to take a little history detour. Under Mao Zedong, there was no socialism. It was just his interpretation of communism, which is now known as Maoism. That consisted of initiatives such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and it's safe to say that it didn't work very well. His successor was Deng Xiaoping, and Deng understood that you can't have communism without first having capitalism. See, according to Karl Marx, capitalism should evolve from the flaws of feudalism, and communism should evolve from the flaws of capitalism. When you look at China, they had a feudal system or a semi-feudal system under the Qing dynasty until 1911. And then, of course, the revolution happened under the Republic of China. They did have a capitalist system for like 10 years before the Japanese invaded. And then once World War II was over, the Chinese Civil War continued with Mao victorious. So in China, there was kind of a transition from feudalism straight to forced communism, which ended very poorly under Mao. Anyways, Deng understood that there needed to be a period of capitalism first. And this is where the term primary socialism comes from. He couldn't call it capitalism because he'd received backlash from the communist left in his party. So it was branded as primary socialism. It's the idea that China is economically underdeveloped compared to the ideology of its people. Their economy was more suited for a capitalist environment, whereas its people supported communism. And so basically, most communist societies have already gone through a period of capitalism with technological innovation and increase in the productivity of workers, but China hasn't gone through that. And therefore, they could not feasibly just blindly implement Marxist economies. Their economy couldn't support that. Therefore, under primary socialism, China was to increase their productivity, modernize the economy, and balance free market policies with centralization. Deng's successor, Jiang Zemin, also supported this policy, and this is where the narrative of liberalization comes from. Right? Credit was cheap, companies popped up left and right, there were buildings built everywhere in China, they joined the World Trade Organization, government expenditures built these massive metropolis cities, and it seemed like China was liberalizing. Jiang's successor, who was also Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, proposed the scientific outlook on development. And it was at this point where China kind of took a more humanist policy approach. The emphasis moved away from economic growth and placed on subjects such as environmentalism and improving living standards. This also meant reallocating resources and more government interventionism. And I think that was around like the early 2000s. That might have marked the inflection point in primary socialism. In the 80s, primary socialism, the people said primary socialism was expected to last for 100 years. It's only been 40 years since then, but I really don't think they're expecting this level of GDP growth in China over the past 40 years. Like, it certainly feels like China's went through 100 years in the past 40. In 1980, their GDP was, let's call it 200 million, and right now, well, it's 14 trillion. That's a 70-fold increase in 40 years. So I think the CCP thinks their phase of primary socialism went faster than expected, and now they can move on to secondary socialism, which is more Marxist ideas. This is some concerning stuff. The CCP is quite obviously transitioning back to socialism after decades of free market policies, in my opinion. I also think this makes sense for a number of reasons. So first of all, as I mentioned, primary socialism was way more successful than they expected it to be, and they think China can now economically support increased socialization. Number two, under the free market, China's exporting everything they make, and this makes them dependent on foreign economic cycles, since now if America's in a recession, it hurts Chinese exports, and thus it hurts the Chinese economy as well. China wants to make themselves a consumer-centered economy, even if it means intervention from the party to make it happen. And what's even more concerning is that Xi Jinping thought is considered one of China's landmark policies, yet how many people actually know about it? Nobody's covering it. Listen to this clip from Manish Prabrai. I don't think he knows about it.
So, I think there are great businesses and great management teams all over the world. And there are many of them in China. And, I think like Charlie Munger would say that the Chinese are natural entrepreneurs. They're actually natural capitalists who were trapped in a socialist system. And so when those shackles were lifted, you actually unleashed something quite dramatic. And, I would say capitalism and entrepreneurship is still very embryonic in China, but it is coming about really quickly. So I think
lots of respect for Mr. Prabrai, but I don't think he understands the ideology of the CCP and the consequences that come with it. Okay, so We now know what the Chinese Communist Party wants to do, but how much can they really do? This will be a short section. We will just be going over the Cybersecurity Act, which is the law that was invoked to take Didi's app off app stores and some other bad stuff. This is the translated version of the 2017 cybersecurity law, and we're going to take a look at a few of the articles in here. So let's start with a definition in Article 31. They define critical information as public communication and information services, power, traffic, a bunch of other services, which, if destroyed, suffering a loss of function, or experiencing a leakage of data, might endanger national security, welfare, the people's livelihood, or public interest. And so with this critical information, we see that in Article 37, this critical information that was collected from operations in China must remain in China. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. Oh, but look at this. In Article 39, we see that the state will promote cybersecurity information sharing among relevant departments, critical information infrastructure operators, and relevant research institutions. And okay, hold on. So from a previous article, I'm not sure which one it is, but they stated that these relevant departments are state-run. So basically, companies that collect critical information need to be willing to share it with state-run departments and other critical information infrastructure operators. That implies literally other companies. I'm not too sure. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but this seems a bit whack. To top it all off, if we go back up to article number 4, we see that the state formulates and continuously improves cybersecurity strategy, clarifies the fundamental requirements and primary goals of ensuring cybersecurity. So they can change the law at their own will. Long story short, the party is legally giving themselves absolute power. If you don't comply, you have to deal with the special departments, which are extensions of the party. And if you do comply, but the party doesn't like you, well, no problem. They can change the laws instantly at their will. Couple more themes here. The law is referenced countless times in this act, and it's very vague as to what it is. As a random person reading the bill, I have no idea what they mean when they say things will be dealt in accordance to the law. But it does make sense. Remember, the party is communist, and communists follow a set of principles, not a set of laws. To them, laws are just a means of getting to the end goal of a communist society with Chinese characteristics. So really, reading the law is kind of useless. You'd be much better off trying to understand their principles like we did in the previous section. And once you do, their actions make a lot more sense. The next step would be then to use these principles to infer the objectives of the party and of regulators. Now, it's worth mentioning that I'm making predictions on the objectives of regulators, but there's no predicting the timeline of this. Chinese regulators do have a history of making U-turns on some radical decisions, so maybe they'll decide the recent crackdowns were too much too fast, and they're going to wait a few years before they continue. I personally don't think so, because the actions they've taken so far have been fairly well received by the Chinese people, at least the ones I've spoken to, and the party has announced a 6-month crackdown a few weeks ago, so. But just know there's always the possibility of temporary policy reversal. So anyways, given the principles of the CCP, I've identified these 5 objectives that I think regulators will aim for going forward. So first, they don't want any company to be too big to fail. The BATX tech conglomerates, that is Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, these guys employ mega network effects, they have impenetrable moats, they're no good. This one's quite obvious, because the CCP has already been throwing punches at Alibaba and Tencent. They know that monopolistic behavior is bad. They know it causes moral hazard. The argument that people who are invested in these companies make is that they will still be able to grow past the antitrust regulation. The problem is, number one, I think the current regulations are just the tip of the iceberg. The move towards communism means increased regulation in the future. Number two, a large part of the historical growth that these companies have comes from acquisitions and monopolistic practices. The CCP stops both of those. I don't really know how much growth is left in them. they've really saturated the Chinese market already. The second objective is protecting national security. They've made this objective also very clear. They don't want any one private company to have too much critical information, especially if they list overseas. This is even written in Xi Jinping thought. The 10th objective is strengthening national security. Any company that wants to be successful in China needs to be willing to share the information they collect with the CCP and ensure that it never leaves China. The third objective is a bit less obvious, but I think more emphasis will be placed on worker protection in the near future. China has been criticized for not having enough worker protection by the West, but in the West, these rights evolved over centuries of capitalism, labor movements, strikes, and whatnot. And the very recent Alibaba investigation of workplace sexual harassment is a great example of this objective starting to be prioritized. I think this will hit labor-intensive industries like food delivery and ride-sharing companies like Didi. I would also mention manufacturing, but that's becoming a lot more automated in China as the labor-intensive manufacturing moves to other parts of Asia with cheaper labor. This objective also aligns with the idea of humanism, which was first proposed by Hu Jintao. The fourth objective is protecting small and mid-sized businesses, or SMBs. Industries such as finance and energy/industrials in China are made up of oligopolies of state-owned enterprises. So this gives SMBs fewer industries to actually be competitive in. If you add in these tech conglomerates, which take up a bunch of other industries now, that's dominating a bunch of other industries, they really have very little room to actually work with. And so this suggests that further tech regulation and subsidies for SMBs that have products that align with the CCP's ideology would make sense. Lastly, recent generations of Chinese people have sort of grown up without communist principles being at the forefront of their lives in education, which I think the government wants to change. Industries like film and music, which are related to culture, could see much heavier regulation in the future, as well as gaming. The Chinese government has compared gaming to opium recently, and that might sound like one of those random statements that the CCP just makes, but this one hits close to home for a lot of Chinese people because of the opium wars. Overall, if you understand the ideology of the party, I think these objectives are quite reasonable and obvious. There are other objectives that I overlooked, probably, but again, there's no predicting the actual timeline of this being executed. All right, now let's briefly take a look at the implications for the market. Let's start with index funds. Some people have suggested buying ETFs of Chinese stocks because they're less vulnerable to targeted regulation. The problem is most of these ETFs have holdings weighted based on the size of companies. So the largest companies make up the largest portion of the fund. In China, the largest companies are either privately owned, in which case they're too big to succeed because of antitrust and subject to severe monopoly regulation as China moves towards communism, or the big companies are state-owned, in which case their goal is not even to make a profit, they're just to support the party's objectives, and historically those state-owned companies' returns have been negligible. So then the only growth left would be the smaller cap technology companies, but they're the ones hurt by cybersecurity regulations. So all of these factors I think would really suppress the returns of a Chinese ETF, and I haven't done much research on this, but I think on a risk-adjusted basis, you'll almost certainly get better returns in other emerging markets like India or Singapore, which I guess Singapore isn't really emerging. Anyways, as for individual stocks, it's not going to be easy either. There are probably some stocks that have been oversold and now below fair value or something, but holding anything in the long run always means you're taking on that political risk. Not only do you have to find a company with growth potential, but also it has to handle regulation well, align with CCP ideology, and you have to trust their accounting numbers, and if you're buying them on a non-Chinese stock exchange, you have to deal with the risk of variable interest entities, or VIEs. I won't even go into that in this video, but basically, if you own a Chinese stock on, say, the New York Stock Exchange, you're actually owning a holding company on some Caribbean island. Tom Nash has a great video on this, I'll link it in the description. Overall, the Chinese market is really difficult to understand and invest in. I'll admit I don't understand it, I'm just sharing what I think I understand. But to reiterate, people are attracted to the astonishing growth that China's had over the past few decades, but it's clear that they've never lost sight of their end goal, which is communism. Their plan for primary socialism was a success, and they're tightening up now. I can't tell you the timing of how soon or how strict future crackdowns will be, but these crackdowns are almost certainly just the beginning. And I think that on a risk-adjusted basis, you have a lot better investment options. A few last pointers for people who do own Chinese companies. China regulates in principles, not rules. So understand the principles and make sure the companies you're invested in abide by these principles. Follow Xinhua News, the official news. If the stock market is a leading indicator to the economy, then Xinhua press releases are like a leading indicator to the stock market, in China at least. As you saw from the first article I shared about the Politburo meeting and antitrust crackdowns from 8 months ago, basically what they promised, or what the press release stated, is exactly what's happening 8 months later, right now. For those considering buying some Chinese shares because they look cheap, I'd just like to say that people that live in China actively avoid their own stock market because of its volatility and political risk. The only reason people in North America are so interested in stocks is because of how popular they were in the months following the COVID crash. I mean, chances are if you're watching this video of some high schooler give his take on complex political environments, you only got into stocks like in the past year and a half. Or I sent this video to you, in which case thanks for watching until the end. Anyways, I hope you found some value in this video. If you know anyone that would benefit from seeing this, it'd be really nice if you could share it with them. All the links I used are in the description. Thanks for watching. Bye.